In last week's video, I talked about the GTX 660 Ti, and we all kind of realized that it's still a very solid used card here in 2018. I also said in that video that it's a direct competitor, at least in terms of price, to the GTX 750 Ti, so today we're going to compare them heads up by benchmarking 10 games. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome to Zach's Tech Turf. Today we're going to be comparing the GTX 660 Ti and the GTX 750 Ti, which are both very solid options for a used gaming PC build here in 2018. And if you want to see even more PC building or benchmarking videos, then hit that subscribe button down below and also that notification bell. That way you never miss an episode. But yeah, let's see what these cards can do. Before getting into the benchmarks, as always, I'll keep this part of the video very short. I want to quickly introduce the exact model of GPUs that we're looking at today. First up is the MSI Twin Frozer 2GB model. Definitely check out the dedicated video that I just did last week if you haven't already. And this card is rocking a core clock of 1019 MHz and a boost clock of 1097 MHz. The card it's squaring off against is the Asus 2GB GTX 750 Ti, which is rocking a core clock slightly higher at 1072 MHz and a boost clock of 1150 MHz. For this video, I did want to see what these cards could do with a little overclock. I didn't push them super hard or anything, but I did manage to get a little bit more out of them. For the 660 Ti, I managed to get an extra 50 MHz on the core clock and 200 MHz on the memory clock, and for the 750 Ti, I got an extra 150 MHz on both the core and memory clock. Our testing platform today is going to be the exact build that I just featured a couple weeks ago in my baller $450 build guide. Definitely be sure to watch that one if you haven't as well. And the only change here is the actual GPUs that we're testing today. This rig is rocking an Intel Xeon X 3470, which boosts up to 3.6 GHz, not overclocked by the way, and it's also packing 16 GB of DDR3 RAM. The first game up was none other than Fortnite. With the Pro settings that I talked about last week, you can literally just Google Fortnite Pro settings and you'll find them. Here you can see that the 660 Ti and 750 Ti averaged pretty much the exact same with a small margin for error. Next up was Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and here we are starting to see the 750 Ti lag behind the 660 Ti by just a bit. At this higher frame rates though, you're not going to see an actual difference, at least in my opinion. Moving on to Rainbow Six Siege, here's the first game that we see a dramatic decrease in performance with the 750 Ti. Once again, just Google Rainbow Six Siege Pro settings and you'll find exactly what I used. It's mostly medium settings with a few minor tweaks. Next up was PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, and here we see pretty much the exact same results as Siege. The 750 Ti is starting to lag back by just a bit. These settings were just 1080p and straight medium. Moving on to Rocket League, the 660 Ti could crank out a very impressive 170 frames per second with quality settings, while the 750 Ti could crank out 146. Obviously, both of these are still great results. Grand Theft Auto 5 followed, and in 1080p with normal settings and the softest shadows, the 660 Ti could manage just above that 100 FPS mark, while the 750 Ti was at 88. Getting into the way tougher to run games, No Man's Sky was up next, and this is the first one I had to crank down to 720p resolution. With low settings, both of these cards average pretty much the exact same at 56 to 57 FPS. Another very demanding game, Assassin's Creed Origins, followed up next, and with a built-in benchmarking tool in 720p and very low settings, we got yet another very similar result as both of them were right under 50 FPS. Far Cry 5 followed with another demanding built-in benchmarking tool, and in 720p and low settings, we got 63 FPS with the 660 Ti and a very similar 61 FPS with the 750 Ti. And finally, to wrap up these benchmarks with the brand new Monster Hunter World, I actually did a full benchmarking video on this one, and in 900p with low settings for the first time today, the 750 Ti actually did a decent amount better with a 52 FPS average compared to the 660 Ti's 42. So I'm not gonna lie, those benchmarks actually surprised me by a little bit. I definitely thought that the 750 Ti would outperform or at least compete with the older 660 Ti, and it turns out that the 660 Ti is actually performing better in most games here in 2018. Keep in mind that the 750 Ti has way better overclocking potential and is much more power efficient, but if you're looking for a graphics card for around 50 bucks on the used market, the 660 Ti might actually be the way to go. Well, that wraps up my comparison video of the GTX 660 Ti and the GTX 750 Ti. You really can't go wrong with either of these cards, so make sure you let me know down in the comment section what card you would go with. Now feel free to head on over to one of these two videos if you haven't seen them yet, and definitely hit that subscribe button because next week we're doing even more benchmarks. You don't want to miss those videos.